The first thing that hit me was the smell: wet cardboard, old grease, and something coppery underneath it that I recognized immediately as blood. My blood, judging by the way my skull throbbed like someone had used it for batting practice. Great. Wonderful. Fantastic start to the afterlife. Hey, pretty boy, you back with us? The voice was gravel wrapped in a bad attitude. I peeled my eyes open. 3 men in ill-fitting black suits loomed over me, blocking out the one working street lamp in this alley, behind a row of shuttered delis. I looked down at myself, a torn Vera Wang suit, once ivory, now streaked with grime and gutter water, one cufflink missing, a boutonnière crushed flat against my chest like a dead insect. 10 minutes ago, I had been Dante Rossi, the man who ran the largest illegal arms pipeline on the eastern seaboard, dying in a fireball set by my own lieutenant. Now I was apparently someone else, wearing someone else's ruined wedding suit, lying in someone else's dumpster. A memory that wasn't mine slid into my head like a knife between the ribs, quick, precise, and it hurt. Ethan Marsh. 26. Adopted into the Kane family at age 9 as a biological contingency, a spare parts bank in a nice suit. Engaged to Alexander Kane, heir to Kane Pharmaceuticals since he was 19. Today was supposed to be the wedding. Today was actually supposed to be the day they strapped him to an operating table and harvested his bone marrow for Alexander's dying boyfriend. Ethan ran. Ethan's weak, sheltered heart gave out somewhere around Delancey Street. Ethan died of fright before these 3 could even catch him. I almost laughed. Of all the bodies in all the cities in all the world, I get reincarnated into the world's saddest jilted bride, except I was the groom, and the marriage was less till death do us part, and more till your spine gives us what we need. Mr. Kane wants you back at the clinic, the lead thug said, cracking his knuckles. He had the build of a man who spent more time in a gym than in school. Come quiet, or we drag you quiet. Either way, you're losing that marrow tonight. Marrow. The word sat wrong in my mouth, and then, against every ounce of logic, I started laughing. It rolled out of me low and slow, then built into something that echoed off the brick walls, because after 40 years of running guns through 3 continents, dying by fire, and waking up in someone else's failed wedding, being threatened by 3 men who thought I was a fainting socialite was, genuinely, the funniest thing that had happened to me in this life or the last one. The hell you laughing at? The lead thug swung. His hand never reached my face. I caught his wrist mid-air, the way I'd caught 1,000 wrists before, and I felt his bones flex under a grip this soft little body had no business having. I twisted. Something snapped with a clean, satisfying crack, and he went down screaming. The other 2 froze. In their memory, Ethan Marsh was a china doll who cried when raising his voice. They had no idea a very different tenant had just moved into the house. I slipped off one ruined dress shoe, turning it lazily in my hand like a toy. You want my marrow? I tilted my head, feeling the cold amusement settle over my face like an old coat. Come get it. They didn't. One went down with a broken nose from my elbow. The second doubled over, gasping after a strike to a pressure point that used to make grown mercenaries cry. The last one backed away so fast he tripped over his own feet. Tell Alexander Kane, I said, crouching to his eye level, voice gentle in the way that used to make men beg. If he wants what's in my bones, he can come collect it himself. He scrambled up and ran, dragging his groaning friends behind him like sacks of laundry. I stood in the wreck of someone else's wedding suit in an alley in a city I didn't recognize, and allowed myself 30 seconds of what is my life before deciding the answer didn't matter. There was a brick wall at the end of the alley, and beyond it, hopefully, some distance between me and the Kane family's operating table. I backed up, hit the wall in a running leap, and hauled myself over the top. I misjudged the landing, badly. I'd been aiming for the soft patch of grass I could see on the other side, a quiet, tree-lined private street that looked like old money, the kind with wrought iron gates and cameras disguised as gargoyles. Instead, gravity had other plans, and I came down hard on the roof of a car. Not just any car, armor-plated, black as a coffin, with a scatter of fresh bullet pockmarks across the bulletproof windshield glass. The scent of gunpowder still hung faint in the night air. Someone had tried to kill the owner of this car very recently, and very unsuccessfully, of course. Of course I land on this one. Footsteps thundered from both ends of the street, men in black tactical gear, faces covered, weapons raised, boxing the car in a pincer. One of them looked up and saw me standing on the roof in a torn wedding suit, and actually stopped walking, stunned into stillness by how deeply strange I must have looked. "Move," he barked, raising his rifle toward the car door. "Or you go down with him," I sighed. Not even a full hour into this new life, and I already had to fight for the second time. This was going to ruin my complexion. The moment his finger tightened on the trigger, I let myself fall. Not a stumble, a controlled drop, twisting midair to drive a kick into his gun arm. The rifle clattered away. I caught it before it hit the pavement, came up in a crouch, and put 2 rounds into the kneecaps of the men flanking him before they'd even processed that the crying bride from the wedding photos on the news had just turned into something out of a war film. Bullets started flying from every direction. I dove behind the car for cover, back pressed to warm metal, breathing hard, blood, this soft, unpracticed body's blood, roaring with an adrenaline that felt like coming home. The driver's door beside me flew open. A hand closed around my wrist and yanked, hard, and I found myself hauled into the back seat of the car on top of a man I had never seen in my life. He was beautiful in the specific, dangerous way expensive things are beautiful. Dark hair, a jaw that looked machined rather than born, and eyes so black they didn't reflect the gunfire flashing outside the windows. He wore a suit that had probably cost more than this car, now with one sleeve torn at the shoulder. There was a thin line of blood at his temple, and he didn't seem to notice it at all. "You have terrible timing," he said, voice low and amused despite the chaos outside, like a man remarking on the weather. His arm had already gone around me, pulling me flush against his chest, shielding my exposed side from the window with his own back. I could feel his heartbeat, slow, controlled, unbothered, against my ribs. Or the best timing in Manhattan, I haven't decided. Damien Wolf, 34, head of the Wolf Organization, the man the city's underworld calls the Wolf King of Manhattan. Cold, precise, and utterly unbothered by the fact that 15 men were currently trying to kill him, for one absurd, suspended second, with bullets cracking against reinforced glass 6 inches from our heads. I forgot to be afraid. I forgot the marrow, the wedding, the dead lieutenant who'd burned me alive in another life. There was only the warmth of his hand splayed protectively against my spine, the low thrum of his pulse under my palm, and the way his eyes, locked onto mine in the dark, held not one flicker of panic, just something sharper, something that looked absurdly like interest. "You're bleeding," I said, because it was easier than admitting my heart was doing something it had no business doing. "So are you." His thumb brushed, just once, over a shallow cut on my cheekbone I hadn't even felt happen. The touch lasted less than a second. It undid something in my chest that 40 years of running an empire had never managed to touch. "Stay down, little bride." Then he kicked the opposite door open, rolled out into the gunfire with a pistol already in each hand, and started dismantling the ambush like a man doing inventory. I stayed exactly where I was for 2 full seconds, stunned, furious at myself for being stunned, and then I picked the rifle back up and went to help him, because whatever this feeling was, it could wait until we weren't both about to die. By the time the shooting stopped, 11 men were down, 4 had run, and I had somehow ended up back to back with Damien Wolf in the middle of the street, both of us breathing hard, both of us, I noted with some private satisfaction, grinning like idiots. 2 black vans rolled up before the sirens even got close, disgorging cleanup crews who moved with the brisk efficiency of men who had done this before. Wounded men bundled away, brass swept up. The whole scene sanitized to a version the NYPD would find thoroughly unremarkable by the time they arrived. Apparently the Wolf King of Manhattan kept a very tidy house, even in the middle of an ambush. "Not bad for a runaway groom," he said, holstering one gun and studying me with open, unhurried curiosity. "You're not what the Kane family described in the missing persons alert. You know Alexander Kane? I know everyone worth knowing in this city, and several people who aren't." He crouched by one of the fallen men, checked his pockets, and pulled out a phone with a company logo I recognized with a bitter jolt, a stylized double helix, Kane Pharmaceuticals. These weren't my usual company either. "My guess is Kane's men crossed paths with mine tonight by accident. You interrupted somebody else's murder attempt on me and got a 2-for-1 deal on assassins." "Lucky me, lucky you," he agreed. And something in his voice made it sound like he meant it a different way. He stood, closing the distance between us, until I had to tip my chin up to hold his gaze. This close, I could see the fine details, a faint white scar bisecting one eyebrow, the ghost of exhaustion under otherwise sharp eyes, like a man who hadn't slept properly in years and had stopped expecting to. Ethan Marsh. ran from his own wedding, broke 3 of Kane's men on the way, then dropped out of the sky onto my car in the middle of a hit. Tell me, what's a socialite's punching bag doing with hands like that? I considered several lies. I discarded all of them, because something about the way he looked at me, assessing, unafraid, faintly delighted, made lying feel like an insult to us both. I'm not who they think I am, I said instead. Not anymore. No, he agreed slowly, gaze dragging once, deliberately, from my torn collar to my split knuckles, cataloging me like a man reappraising a stock he'd underpriced. You're really not. Sirens started somewhere in the distance. He exhaled, unbothered, and pulled his ruined jacket off his own shoulders to drop it over mine, covering the worst of the blood and grime on my suit, with the casual authority of a man used to being obeyed without needing to explain why. Come on, little bride. Before the NYPD asks either of us uncomfortable questions. He turned toward a second car idling at the end of the block, one that had apparently escaped the ambush entirely, and glanced back at me over his shoulder, one eyebrow raised in silent challenge. Unless you'd rather explain to Alexander Kane why his marrow donor just field-dressed 11 of his competitors' hitmen. I looked down at the jacket around my shoulders, warm, smelling faintly of cedar and gun smoke, and then up at the man holding the car door open like it was the most natural thing in the world to abduct a stranger in a wedding suit. Lead the way, I said, and got in. The penthouse took up the entire top floor of a converted warehouse in Tribeca, all exposed brick and steel beams and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the East River like the city itself was something Damien owned, rather than merely lived above. Sit. Bleed on the leather, I don't care, he said, disappearing into another room and returning with a first aid kit that looked more field hospital than medicine cabinet. A woman with sharp red-framed glasses and an even sharper expression breezed in without knocking, phone in one hand, tablet in the other, entirely unbothered by the blood-stained man on the sofa. Sophia Reyes, 26, Damien's executive assistant and unofficial minister of chaos control, sharper-tongued than most of the men on the payroll, and the only person in the building Damien actually listens to. Boss, you're 2 a.m. Was a hit squad, apparently, and there's a missing groom trending on 3 different gossip accounts. She stopped, looked at me, looked at Damien, looked back at me, and smiled like she'd just found the last slice of cake at a party. Oh, that's the missing groom, Sophia. I'm just saying the resemblance to the Kane wedding photo is, wow, actually not close at all, he looks like he could kill someone. She tapped rapidly at her tablet. Which? Checking the traffic cam footage from 3 blocks over. Yeah, he did. Several summons. Sophia leaving. She threw me a wink on her way out. Nice suit, by the way. Very I survived my own funeral chic. Damien dropped onto the sofa beside me with an antiseptic swab, ignoring my glare when he took my jaw in one hand to clean the cut on my cheek with more gentleness than a man of his reputation had any right to possess. You could let a doctor do this, I said, mostly to have something to say, because his thumb kept brushing too close to the corner of my mouth and my pulse. Ethan's weak, unpracticed pulse was making a fool of me. I don't let strangers close enough to hurt me. Occupational habit. His eyes flicked up to mine, and for a moment the amusement dropped away into something quieter, more deliberate. You're not a stranger anymore, though. Not after tonight. You don't know anything about me. I know you broke a man's wrist without blinking. I know you went for cover, like someone who's done it 100 times, not 0. I know Alexander Kane wants you back badly enough to send men who don't miss, and you still ran. He set the swab down, close enough now that I could count the flecks of gray in otherwise black eyes. I know you looked at gunfire tonight like it was a relief instead of a nightmare. That tells me plenty, little bride. More than a stranger. My breath caught somewhere behind my ribs, a lifetime of ice-cold composure, the kind that had let Dante Rossi negotiate with cartels and betray 3 governments without a flicker of nerve, and this man's steady voice and too honest mouth had me forgetting how to breathe like some green recruit. What do you want from me? I asked, quieter than I meant to. Tonight? Nothing. His hand found mine, thumb tracing once over my split knuckles, not asking permission and somehow not needing to. Stay here until it's safe. Whatever's between you and Kane, I have a feeling it's about to become my business too. I should have pulled my hand back. I didn't. Why would you get involved? His smile turned slow, dangerous, and entirely too fond for a man he'd known 2 hours. Because I already decided I like you, Ethan Marsh. And I don't share what's mine. Not with Alexander Kane, not with anyone. Mine. The word landed somewhere under my sternum and stayed there, glowing like a coal. Somewhere in my chest, a dead man's old caution whispered that this was reckless, that trusting a stranger this fast was how kings lost their crowns. I told the voice to shut up, and let my hand stay exactly where it was. Morning arrived with sunlight, the smell of coffee that Damien apparently made himself, badly but with commitment, and the uncomfortable realization that I liked waking up in his apartment more than I should have, 12 hours into knowing the man. "Tell me about Kane," he said, sliding a mug across the kitchen island that was more counter art than usable furniture. "All of it." So I did. Ethan's memories laid bare over burnt coffee, the adoption at 9, quietly arranged by a Kane family lawyer who called it a compatibility placement, and never explained what that meant until Ethan turned 18, and someone finally told him the truth. His tissue markers were a rare match for Alexander's boyfriend, a fragile, sickly young man named Preston Vale, who had supposedly been fighting leukemia since childhood. The engagement had been a leash disguised as love, 6 years of Ethan being told he was cherished while quietly being kept alive, tested and monitored like livestock for the day his marrow would be needed. "And Preston Vale," Damien said slowly, setting down his mug. "That's Kane's fiancé's name? You know him?" "I know of him." Something calculating moved behind his eyes. "I've had someone tailing Kane's inner circle for unrelated reasons. A supply dispute, nothing to do with you. Preston Vale doesn't go to a single hospital. No chemo, no oncologist, nothing. He does, however, go to a very expensive skincare clinic twice a month, and a very private financial advisor once a week." He looked at me steadily. "I think your fiancé's dying boyfriend isn't dying at all, Ethan." The words landed like a physical blow, and then, absurdly, like a punchline. 6 years. 6 years of being told his body wasn't fully his because a stranger was dying, and the stranger had been lying the entire time. I started laughing, the same bitter, helpless laugh from the alley, and Damien watched me do it without flinching, like he understood exactly what kind of laugh it was. "He was never sick," I said, once I could speak again. "He just wanted my marrow. Or wanted me gone, or wanted." I stopped. "It doesn't matter what he wanted. It matters what I'm going to do about it. And what's that?" I looked up, and something in me, some cold, calculating piece of Dante Rossi that had built an empire out of exactly this kind of leverage, settled into place behind my eyes. "I'm going to make Alexander Kane very publicly regret ever putting me in a wedding dress." Damien's smile went slow and wolfish, delighted in a way that made my stomach flip embarrassingly. He reached across the island, tucked a loose strand of hair behind my ear with a gentleness that didn't match anything else about him, and let his hand linger against my jaw a beat too long. "There he is," he murmured, low and pleased, like he'd been waiting all night to say it. "The version of you that survived a hit squad in heels, sorry, dress shoes." His thumb traced my cheekbone once more, slow and deliberate. "I like this version considerably more than the missing person's flyer." "Careful, Mr. Wolf," I said, voice lower than I intended. "You're starting to sound like a man with a crush. I'm a man who knows what he wants when he sees it." He didn't blink, didn't retreat, close enough now that I could feel his breath against my mouth. "I'm patient about most things. I don't think I'm going to be patient about you." The kitchen was very quiet. My heart, Ethan's weak, foolish, wonderful heart, was doing something it had never once done through years of arms deals and death threats. I found myself leaning in a fraction of an inch before either of us decided to be reasonable about it, and, "Boss, we have a Kane Pharmaceuticals car parked outside, and Alexander Kane himself just walked into the lobby, demanding to see his fiancée." Sophia's voice crackled through the intercom with the timing of a woman who lived to interrupt romantic moments. "Should I let security handle it, or do we want a scene?" Damien didn't move away immediately. He looked at me, something wicked lighting up behind his eyes. "Oh," he said softly, "we absolutely want a scene. Alexander Kane, 32, CEO of Kane Pharmaceuticals, Ethan's former fiancée, polished, controlled, and used to getting exactly what he wants without ever raising his voice. He looked exactly like his memory portrait, tall, silver-tied, handsome in the sterile way of a man who'd been photographed for magazine covers his entire adult life. He stood in the middle of Damien's lobby, with 2 security men flanking him, and an expression of wounded, righteous concern that might have worked on the old Ethan. It did nothing for me. "Ethan," he said, stepping forward with both hands out like a man greeting a spooked animal. "Thank God, I've been out of my mind. When you didn't come back after the ceremony, I thought, You thought your marrow bank had grown legs and run off before the harvest, I said pleasantly. Reasonable assumption. His hands froze mid-air. Behind me, Damien made a soft, appreciative sound, arms folding as he leaned against the elevator frame to enjoy the show. Ethan, that's not what this is. Preston is dying. You know what he means to me. I never wanted to hurt you, Preston Vale doesn't have a single oncologist on retainer, I said, watching every muscle in Alexander's face freeze. But he does have a skincare clinic he visits twice a month. Funny the things you find when you actually look. The color drained from his face in a way that told me everything he hadn't known. 6 years of loyalty to a lie, and the great Alexander Kane genuinely hadn't known. He wouldn't. He stopped. Something cracked behind his composed CEO mask, real and human and for 1 second almost pitiable, almost. You're lying. I don't lie, I said. I used to run an empire built on knowing exactly who was lying to me and who wasn't. Trust me, Alexander. I know a con when I smell one, and your boyfriend reeks of it. I want you home, he said instead, voice sharpening, control snapping back into place, like a man remembering he was used to winning. Whatever games you're playing with this criminal, a sneer toward Damien, who only smiled wider, entirely unbothered by the insult, it ends today. You're still my fiancé. He's not anything of yours, Damien said, voice gone soft and lethal in a way that made even the security men flinch. He crossed the lobby unhurried, coming to stand at my shoulder, not crowding, just present, a wall of quiet promise. You had 6 years to earn his loyalty, and you spent it lying to him about his own body. That's over now. He's under my protection. Under your, Alexander laughed, disbelieving. You've known him for a day. Longer than that, I said, surprising myself with how easily the words came, how true they felt despite the calendar's protests. It only took 11 bullets and one really terrible cup of coffee. Something in Alexander's face went very still, very cold, the mask of wounded fiancé sliding away to reveal the calculating businessman underneath, the one who'd built an empire on turning people into assets. You'll regret this, he said low, aimed at both of us. Kane Pharmaceuticals doesn't lose. I'll have my father's lawyers on this within the hour, and if that doesn't work... His eyes cut to Damien, sharp and ugly. I have friends in the DEA who'd love to know the Wolf Organization's warehouse addresses. Careful, Damien said, still perfectly pleasant, which was somehow more frightening than shouting. Threats tend to shorten a man's future considerably faster than patience does. Ask around. Alexander left without another word, security trailing him like a bad smell, and the elevator doors closed on his retreating back with a soft, final chime. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Well, I said, into the sudden quiet, that went about as well as expected. Damien turned to me, and whatever cold authority had been in his face a moment ago melted into something warmer, softer, almost boyish with satisfaction. You called me your protection, he said. I said no such thing. You implied it very thoroughly. He stepped close again, tucking a knuckle under my chin, tilting my face up toward his with an easy confidence that should have irritated me, and instead made my pulse trip over itself. I liked it. You like a lot of things about me for a man who met me yesterday, I told you. His mouth curved, dangerously close to mine, his voice dropping to something meant only for me. I'm not a patient man, little bride, not about this. This time, when he closed the distance, I didn't lean away. His mouth met mine, soft at first, questioning, and when I answered by fisting a hand in his shirt and pulling him closer, the softness broke into something hungrier. Something that tasted like gunpowder and burnt coffee, and 6 months' worth of loneliness finally being answered. His hand cradled the back of my head like I was something worth being careful with, even as the kiss went deep and certain, and every cold, dead-eyed year of Dante Rossi's old life burned away under it, replaced with something that felt, terrifyingly, like home. When we broke apart, both of us were breathing like we'd run a mile. For the record, Damien murmured against my mouth. I've wanted to do that since you fell on my car. For the record, I said back, unable to fight my own grin. So have I. Damien's idea of a first date, it turned out, was booking an entire rooftop restaurant 3 days after the lobby confrontation. Not because he needed the privacy, he insisted, but because the last time he'd taken someone to a public restaurant, a rival family had tried to shoot him over the appetizers, and he'd rather not repeat the experience on my account. That's not romantic, I said, arms crossed, watching Marco and 2 other men do a slow, thorough sweep of the rooftop before they'd even let the waiter bring water. That's a hostage negotiation with candles. It's thoughtful, Damien corrected, pulling out my chair with a formality that looked faintly ridiculous on a man who'd shot 3 people from a moving vehicle 4 days earlier. I'm trying very hard to be normal about this. You bought out an entire restaurant. I tipped generously and asked politely. You had Marco sweep the rooftop for snipers. That, he said, sitting across from me with the unbothered confidence of a man used to being obeyed, was just good manners. I laughed despite myself, and something in his face softened at the sound, like he'd been chasing that exact reaction all evening and finally caught it. The food came and went in a blur I barely remembered later, some elaborate tasting menu Damien had chosen without consulting me, because apparently the Wolf King of Manhattan had opinions about wine pairings, but I remembered the small things with startling clarity. The way the city lights caught in his eyes when he wasn't performing composure for anyone. The way he reached across the table twice, unthinking, just to touch my wrist, like he needed the reassurance that I was actually there, and not some fever dream his exhausted mind had conjured after a bad week. Tell me something true, I said, somewhere around the 3rd course, emboldened by good wine and better company. Something you wouldn't tell anyone else. He considered it for a long moment, turning his glass slowly by the stem. I've had 4 serious relationships in my life, he said finally. All of them ended because the other person got tired of coming second to the business. I stopped trying after the last one, told myself I didn't need it. His eyes came up to meet mine, steady and unguarded in a way I was starting to understand was rare for him. Then you fell out of the sky in a wedding suit, and I spent the next 6 hours discovering exactly how wrong I'd been. My chest did something complicated and warm. That's dangerously close to romantic, Mr. Wolf. Don't tell anyone. I have a reputation. Your reputation is currently ruining my dinner with a security detail on the roof. My reputation, he said, reaching across the table to lace his fingers through mine, unhurried and certain, just wants to make sure it gets to have more dinners like this one. We didn't make it to dessert. Somewhere between the 4th course and the wine running low, he pulled me up from the table and out onto the open half of the rooftop. City lights sprawled out beneath us in every direction, and danced with me, badly, both of us laughing too hard to keep any real rhythm, to music that wasn't even playing, just because he wanted an excuse to hold on to me a little longer. For a hardened criminal, I said, forehead against his shoulder, feeling more at ease than I had in either of my lives. You're a terrible dancer. I'm excellent at several things, he said, spinning me in a slow, clumsy circle that nearly knocked over an unoccupied table. Dancing was never one of them. I'm working on my priorities. And what's at the top of the list now? He stopped moving entirely, tipping my chin up with 2 fingers, the rooftop wind catching in his hair, city noise falling away into something that felt, for one suspended moment, like the whole world had gone quiet just for us. You, he said simply, and kissed me like the answer had never once been in question. Word of the lobby confrontation spread fast enough that by the next morning, half of Damien's organization had found some excuse to walk past the penthouse gym, hoping for a glimpse of the runaway groom who broke Kane's men with a stiletto heel. I gave them a better show than gossip. Again, Damien said, circling me on the mats with his jacket discarded and his sleeves rolled to the elbow, the picture of a man entirely too pleased with his own idea. You're pulling the kick. This body might be soft, but the instincts underneath aren't. Trust them. You just want an excuse to watch me sweat, I said, but I squared my stance anyway, because he wasn't wrong. Every time I held back out of some misplaced deference to Ethan's fragile reputation, my aim went crooked. The moment I stopped thinking and let 40 years of muscle memory answer instead, I put him flat on his back in under 4 seconds. He looked up at me from the mat, breathless, grinning like he'd won something instead of lost. There he is, he said, and reached up, not to get up, but to pull me down on top of him instead, hands settling at my waist like they belonged there. I could get used to losing to you. You could also get up before Marco walks in and starts narrating. Too late. Marco called cheerfully from the doorway, already filming on his phone. Sophia's starting a pool on when the boss finally gets you a ring that isn't just for reconnaissance. Out, Damien said, without any real force behind it, one hand still curled warm and possessive at the small of my back, the other coming up to brush a damp strand of hair from my forehead with a tenderness that made the whole gym go quiet around us. I mean it this time. Marco left, laughing. Damien didn't let go of me for a long, unhurried moment, just looked up at me with an expression I was starting to recognize, equal parts hunger and disbelief, like a man who kept waiting to wake up from a very good dream. "You're staring," I said. "I'm memorizing," he corrected, thumb tracing the line of my jaw. "In case you disappear on me again, I fell out of the sky onto your car once. I'm not exactly in the habit of vanishing." "Good," he said, and pulled me down into a kiss that tasted like exertion and something dangerously close to forever, right there on the mats, with the whole building undoubtedly listening through the door Marco had conveniently left cracked open. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of strategy sessions, stolen kisses in the penthouse kitchen, and the slow, delicious process of dismantling Alexander Kane's life piece by piece. Marco Diaz, 29, Damien's second-in-command. Loyal to a fault, hopelessly bad at hiding his opinions, and the only person in the organization who dared tease his boss to his face. "You know," Marco said one evening, watching Damien rearrange his entire schedule around driving me to a jeweler's appointment I hadn't asked for. "In 6 years running with this man, I've never once seen him cancel a supplier meeting, for anyone. And now he's out here picking out cufflinks. They're for a gala," Damien said, not looking up from the tray of rings the jeweler had laid out, none of which he seemed satisfied by. "The Kane Pharmaceuticals shareholder gala. Ethan's going to attend as my guest and ruin Alexander's night in front of every investor who matters." "Uh-huh. And the ring shopping?" Damien's ears went faintly pink, which was, I'd learned, the only visible sign the Wolf King of Manhattan possessed of embarrassment. "Reconnaissance." "For a ring, Marco. I'm just saying. Boss, most men do the murder plot and the marriage proposal in a different order." "Out," Damien said, and Marco left, cackling, while I bit back a laugh of my own, and pretended not to notice the way Damien's jaw was doing something complicated and soft when he thought I wasn't looking. I let him have the moment. I had my own plans to attend to, quiet calls to a hacker I remembered from a past life, calls that traced Preston Vale's spending patterns back 6 years and turned up a private offshore account funded, quarter after quarter, in Alexander's name. Not medical bills, payments, a very expensive, very long-running acting job. By the night of the gala, I had a folder of evidence thick enough to end a career, a black suit Damien had insisted on paying for despite my protests, and, tucked in my jacket pocket, one very specific weapon, the truth. The night before the gala, the jeweler who'd sold Damien half a tray of rings he never bought sent an invoice, and tucked innocently among the line items, a note thanking Mr. Wolf and his lovely companion for their patronage, with a small sketch of a ring circled twice in pen. Sophia, delighted, read it aloud to the entire penthouse before Damien could stop her. "Lovely companion," I repeated, arching a brow at him over my coffee. "Is that what I am now? I thought I was your protection detail. You're my—" Damien stopped, visibly recalculating, ears going that same telltale pink. "You're mine. The label's still in development. Careful," I said deadpan, "or I'll start telling people I'm just your bodyguard's understudy. You broke a man's wrist in a dumpster and shot 3 assassins before breakfast. You are not anyone's understudy." The moment lightened further when a courier arrived not 10 minutes later with a bouquet, not from Damien, but from an anonymous sender. The card signed only with an elegant K. Alexander, apparently, hadn't entirely given up. I watched with no small amount of private delight as Damien's whole demeanor shifted the instant he read the card. Jaw tight, shoulders squared, every ounce of the Wolf King settling back over him like armor. "He sends flowers now," Damien said, low and flat, turning the bouquet over like he were inspecting it for hidden explosives, which, given his line of work, was not an unreasonable first instinct. "After 6 years of treating you like a blood bank. Are you jealous, Mr. Wolf?" "I am reassessing security protocols," he said, with the wounded dignity of a man who was in fact entirely jealous. I took the bouquet from his hands, walked it calmly to the kitchen, and dropped it, card and all, straight into the disposal, flipping the switch without ceremony. The grinding roar of shredded roses was, I decided, extremely satisfying. "There," I said, over the noise. "Reassessed." Damien watched me do it with an expression that started as surprise and finished as something far warmer. Crossing the kitchen in 3 long strides to back me against the counter, hands braced on either side of me, close enough that I could feel the words against my mouth before he said them. "I love you," he said, plainly, unhurried, like the confession had been sitting loaded and ready for days, and the flowers had simply pulled the trigger. "I know it's fast." I don't particularly care. I've run this city for a decade without losing my head over anyone, and you've had me rearranging my calendar for jewelry appointments within a week. My chest went tight and warm all at once, old instincts scrambling uselessly against a feeling a lifetime of gun running had never once prepared me for. I love you too, I said, and meant it so completely it startled a laugh out of both of us, disbelieving and delighted in equal measure. Which is deeply inconvenient, considering I'm supposed to be plotting your rival's downfall tomorrow night, not falling apart in your kitchen. Multitask, Damien said, and kissed me until the smell of shredded roses was the last thing on either of our minds. Alexander did not take the lobby confrontation lying down. 2 nights before the gala, one of Damien's warehouses near the Brooklyn waterfront went up in a controlled fire. Not enough to kill anyone, Damien noted grimly, studying the security footage, but enough to send a message. Bruno Hale, 41, head of Kane Pharmaceuticals Security. Former military, humorless, and fanatically loyal to the family that had employed him for 2 decades. He's getting desperate, Marco said, arms crossed over the security monitor, watching grainy footage of 3 masked figures, Bruno Hale unmistakably among them, even masked, by the particular stiff-backed gait of a man who'd spent 20 years marching, slip in and out of the loading bay. Desperate men make mistakes. Desperate men also make bigger fires, Damien said, jaw tight, already reaching for his coat. I'm going to go have a conversation with Mr. Hale. We're going to have a conversation with Mr. Hale, I corrected, already halfway into my own jacket. Damien paused at the door, looking back at me with the particular expression he wore whenever I insisted on walking into danger at his side instead of staying safely behind, equal parts exasperation and helpless fondness, a battle he'd stopped trying to win days ago. You know I'm going to worry the entire drive. You worry beautifully, I said, breezing past him toward the elevator. Try to keep up, Wolf. We found Bruno Hale not at the warehouse, but 3 blocks from it, sitting in an idling car with the patience of a man who'd wanted to be found. Alexander's parting message delivered through the last loyal soldier still willing to carry it. Mr. Kane wants you both to know, Bruno said, unbothered by the 2 guns leveled at him from either side of his car window, that this isn't over. He's lost the company, lost Vale, lost the wedding, but he's not going to lose quietly. Neither will we, I said, leaning into the window with a calm that came from 4 decades of exactly this kind of conversation. Tell him something for me, Mr. Hale. Tell him the next warehouse fire, the next message, the next anything. I won't send a folder to a reporter next time. I'll send it to the FDA, the SEC, and every hospital ethics board in the tri-state area, along with a very detailed account of what compatibility placement actually means at Kane Pharmaceuticals. See how his father's board of directors feels about that headline. Bruno's jaw worked, some flicker of genuine unease breaking through decades of soldierly composure. He's not going to stop, Bruno said, quieter now. Then he'll stop existing as a CEO, Damien said, voice like ice cracking underfoot. One way or another, this ends this week. Tell him to choose which way. We watched Bruno's taillights disappear around the corner, and Damien let out a breath, some of the tension bleeding out of his shoulders now that the immediate threat had passed. You're shaking, I said, noticing the faint tremor in his hand as he holstered his weapon. Not fear, I realized, but the aftershock of having stood between me and danger and not needing to fire a single shot. I don't like it when he comes near you, Damien admitted, low, pulling me against his chest right there on the sidewalk, uncaring of who might see. Even secondhand, even through a hired man in a parked car. I survived him for 6 years before you ever showed up, I reminded him gently, feeling his heartbeat slow gradually under my palm. I can survive a warehouse fire and a threatening phone call. I know. He pressed his lips to my temple, unhurried, grounding himself in the simple fact of me being solid and present under his hands. Doesn't mean I have to like it. Humor me. I suppose I can allow a little humoring, I said, and let him hold on exactly as long as he needed to. The Kane Pharmaceuticals shareholder gala was held in a glass-walled ballroom overlooking Central Park. 300 of the city's wealthiest and most easily scandalized guests gathered under crystal chandeliers. The car ride there was quieter than I expected. Damien kept my hand in his the entire way, thumb tracing slow circles over my knuckles, and every few blocks I caught him glancing over like he was checking I hadn't changed my mind. You don't have to do this tonight, he said, as the skyline of Central Park South came into view. We could wait. Build a stronger case. I have people who could make Alexander's life very difficult without you ever setting foot in that ballroom. I know. I turned my hand over in his, lacing our fingers together properly. But he spent 6 years telling me my body wasn't mine to keep. I want to be the one standing there when it stops being true. Not a lawyer, not a headline written by someone else. Me. Damien was quiet for a moment, studying me with an expression that had stopped trying to hide how much he admired me somewhere around our second week together. Then I'll be right beside you, he said. The whole time. I know that too, I said, and meant it more than I'd meant almost anything in either of my lives. The valet took the car. The doorman, recognizing Damien on sight, didn't so much as blink at the sight of Alexander Kane's former fiancée walking in on the arm of the city's most notorious crime boss, which told me everything about how thoroughly gossip had already outpaced the actual scandal. Inside, string quartets played something tasteful and forgettable. Waiters moved through the crowd with trays of champagne, and Alexander Kane held court near the stage in a tailored tuxedo, laughing at something one of his board members had said, entirely unaware his evening was about to end in ruins. Alexander saw me the moment I walked in on Damien's arm, and something in his composed face cracked like ice underfoot. "You have some nerve," he hissed, catching my elbow the second I was within reach, low enough that only the three of us could hear. Showing up here, on his arm, in front of my investors. "Actually," I said, pleasant as ever, "I'm here to do you a favor." I raised my voice. Not shouting, just pitched to carry, the way Dante Rossi used to command a room of hardened men into silence with a single sentence. "Everyone, before the toasts begin, I think you'll all want to hear a little bit about Kane Pharmaceuticals' upcoming charity initiative, the one funding Preston Vale's leukemia treatment." The room quieted, curious. Preston, seated at the head table in a suit that cost more than most people's cars, went pale. "Except," I continued, pulling the folder from my jacket and handing it, with a small, courteous smile, to the reporter from the Financial Times I'd made sure was seated in the third row. "There is no leukemia. There's no treatment. There's an offshore account that's received 6 years of quarterly payments labeled medical, routed instead into a property portfolio in the Caymans under Mr. Vale's name. Feel free to check the documentation. I had it independently verified." The murmur that swept the ballroom was immediate and vicious. 300 wealthy investors doing math on exactly how much of their goodwill and their donations had funded a con man's beach house. "That's absurd," Alexander said, too loud, too fast, the sound of a man watching his empire slide sideways in real time. "Preston has been sick since we were in college." "Has he?" I turned to Preston, whose expression had gone from pale to genuinely, spectacularly panicked. "Or has he just been very good at crying on cue while you signed away my body to save him?" Preston's mouth opened, closed, opened again, and then, in front of 300 witnesses and one very interested reporter, he did the one thing that sealed the entire evening. He ran. Security caught him at the coat check, folder of financial records already being photographed by 4 separate phones, and the gala dissolved into the kind of scandal that would headline every business page in the city by morning. Alexander turned to me, stripped of every ounce of composure, something raw and furious, and underneath it, genuinely broken. 6 years, he said, hoarse. I loved him for 6 years, and I spent 6 years being told my body wasn't fully mine because of it. I said, gentler now, because there was no triumph left in kicking a man already on the ground. "I'm not sorry for tonight, Alexander, but I hope, eventually, you find something worth loving that isn't a lie." I turned and walked back to Damien, who was watching me with an expression I'd never once seen on the face of a man who ran half the city's underworld. Something helpless, something proud, something that looked a great deal like falling. "Marry me," he said, quiet, right there in the wreckage of the gala. No ring, no plan, just the words falling out of him like he couldn't hold them any longer. "That's not how you propose to someone, Wolf," I said, laughing, despite the tears stinging unexpectedly at my eyes. "I know." He took both my hands, thumbs brushing over my knuckles, forehead dropping to rest against mine while the ballroom buzzed with scandal around us, entirely forgotten. "I'll do it properly. Tonight was just, I couldn't wait anymore. Watching you stand there and take your whole life back, with nothing but a folder and a spine of steel." He exhaled, unsteady, the coldest man in Manhattan undone completely. "I've never wanted anything the way I want you, Ethan Marsh. Say yes eventually. I can be patient about the timeline. I'm done being patient about the outcome. I looked at him, this beautiful, dangerous, absurdly soft-hearted man who had shielded me from bullets on our first night and rearranged his entire empire around a jeweler's appointment 2 weeks later, and felt something settle in my chest that 40 years and one entire lifetime had never quite managed to give me. Ask me properly, I said, and find out. He asked me properly 6 days later at 6 in the morning on a private runway at Teterboro after I told him, half in jest, half genuinely testing him, that I was thinking of disappearing to a beach somewhere and letting the city forget the whole scandal ever happened. I hadn't actually meant it. Old habits die hard. Some paranoid, 1,000 years dead part of Dante Rossi still packed a go-bag out of instinct whenever a plan concluded successfully. I'd barely finished zipping the suitcase before 15 black SUVs came screaming onto the tarmac and blocked my jet's path entirely. Damien stepped out of the lead car in a suit that had clearly been thrown on in a hurry, tie crooked, hair a mess, looking for all the world like a man who'd broken every speed limit in Manhattan to get here. Going somewhere? He asked, striding up the stairs to where I stood at the top, arms crossed, biting back a smile. Thinking about it. Beach. Sunshine. No Mafia gunfights. No. He said it simply, arriving close enough that I could feel the heat off him despite the morning chill, and reached into his jacket. Not for a gun, for once, but a small velvet box that looked comically delicate in his large hands. You made me a promise in a burning ballroom, Ethan. I intend to collect. He opened the box. Inside sat a ring, deep blue stone catching the runway lights, and beneath it a small brass key. The ring is obvious, he said, voice rough with something that wasn't quite steady. The key is to the penthouse, not as my guest, as whatever you want to call it, mine. Partner, the only person alive who's ever made the Wolf King of Manhattan cancel a business meeting for a jewelry appointment. His mouth twitched despite the nerves playing on his face. Marry me, properly, this time. No burning ballroom required. 300 feet away, I could see Marco and Sophia peering out from behind an SUV, clearly having driven all the way here just to watch, Sophia already filming on her phone. I looked at the ring, at the key, at this ridiculous, devoted, dangerous man standing on an airport tarmac at 6 in the morning because he couldn't stand the thought of me leaving. I was never actually getting on that plane, I admitted. I know, he said. I still needed the excuse to do this properly. I laughed, really laughed, bright and unguarded, the kind of sound Ethan's old life had never once produced, and Dante's old life certainly hadn't either, and held out my hand. Yes, I said. Obviously, yes. He kissed me on the airport stairs, slow and certain, while somewhere behind us, Sophia whooped loud enough to startle a flock of birds off a nearby hangar roof, and Marco could be heard muttering, finally, under his breath. The wedding took place a month later, at a stone chapel on a Hamptons estate that Damien had, in typical fashion, bought outright rather than merely rent for the day. I wore charcoal instead of white this time, my choice, a quiet rejection of the last wedding suit I remembered, the one that had ended in a dumpster and a broken wrist. Damien wore black, sharp, and immaculate, and the way his breath caught when he saw me walking down the aisle made every ounce of chaos that had brought us here worth it twice over. The officiant reached the vows, and Damien's voice didn't waver once. I, Damien, take you, Ethan, for exactly who you are. Every sharp edge, every unexpected right hook, every terrifying moment you fell out of the sky and turned my whole life sideways. I will spend the rest of my life being glad you did. When it was my turn, I paused, and old habits decided the moment called for one last negotiation. Before I say it, I said, straight-faced, while 300 wedding guests held a collective breath, the deed to the Tribeca penthouse, signed over to both our names, and I want veto power over Marco's playlist choices at every future company party. A beat of stunned silence, and then Damien threw his head back and laughed, a full, unguarded sound I'd only ever heard in private, now echoing off the chapel's stone walls in front of God and 300 witnesses. Done, he said, still laughing, pulling a folded document from his jacket pocket with theatrical flourish. I had the deed drawn up 2 weeks ago. I know you, little bride. I was counting on the negotiation. The chapel dissolved into laughter and applause, and I found myself grinning so hard my face ached, holding out my hand for the ring while Damien slid it onto my finger with a steadiness that belied how badly his other hand was shaking. I do, I said, when the officiant finally, belatedly, got to ask the actual question. I love you, Damien murmured back. Only for me right before he kissed me in front of everyone. No ambush, no gunfire, no marrow harvest looming at the end of the aisle. Just this, just him. 2 lifetimes of running, fighting, and dying alone, and I had finally, impossibly, landed exactly where I belonged, on the roof of a bulletproof car, in the arms of a man who never once asked me to be anything other than exactly what I was. They took 10 days after the wedding, Damien's idea, delivered as a fait accompli rather than a question, in the form of 2 boarding passes to Turks and Caicos, left on my pillow the morning after the reception. "You already bought the tickets," I pointed out, holding them up, before I said I'd go. "I bought them the week I met you," he admitted, entirely unashamed, pulling a shirt over his head while I tried and failed to look unimpressed. "I told you, not a patient man." The villa sat on a private stretch of beach, so quiet, the loudest sound most mornings was the tide. We spent the first 2 days doing absolutely nothing productive, reading in the shade, arguing cheerfully over what to order for dinner, Damien attempting to teach me to spearfish, and mostly succeeding only in losing his sunglasses to the reef. On the 3rd night, sitting with our feet in the cooling sand and a bottle of wine between us, he told me, quietly, without any of his usual polish, about the mother who'd died when he was 12, the father who'd handed him a gun before a diploma, the decade he'd spent convinced that running an empire and being loved by someone were mutually exclusive states. "You make it look easy," he said, watching the waves instead of me, uncharacteristically unguarded. "Being like this, warm. I used to think I'd burned that part of myself out of necessity, somewhere around 20. "You didn't burn it out," I said, resting my head against his shoulder, feeling the tension in him ease under my palm where it rested on his chest. "You just hadn't found anyone worth thawing for yet." He turned his head, pressed a kiss to my hair, and didn't say anything else for a long while. Didn't need to. Some silences said more than any vow at any altar ever could. We flew home tanned, unhurried, and thoroughly unwilling to let go of each other's hands the entire flight, much to Marco's exaggerated disgust when he picked us up from the airport with a sign that read, in his own handwriting, "Welcome back, lovebirds," held upside down on purpose, 6 months later. "Absolutely not," I said, staring at the enormous, snarling, entirely too large dog currently drooling on the penthouse's white marble floor. "We are not keeping a cane corso named after a Roman emperor in an apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows and no yard." "His name is Nero, and he's a rescue," Damien said, with the particular stubbornness of a man who had clearly already decided this argument was over before it began. "Marco found him guarding an empty warehouse we bought out. Nobody else was going to take him. Marco found a 200-pound dog and immediately thought of us. Marco thinks you're a soft touch under all the terror," Damien said, sliding an arm around my waist from behind, while I glared uselessly at the dog, who thumped his tail against the floor, like he sensed the argument was already lost. "He's not wrong. I broke a man's wrist in a dumpster alley 6 months ago. And now you're going to feed my dog breakfast, because you love me," Damien said, entirely too smug, pressing a kiss to the side of my neck that made every argument I had left dissolve into something far less coherent. "Our dog," I muttered, already reaching for the bag of kibble Marco had helpfully left on the counter, and Damien's grin against my skin told me he'd heard exactly what he wanted to hear. Married life with the Wolf King of Manhattan was, against every prediction I'd have made in my first life, disgustingly domestic. Sunday mornings meant Damien attempting pancakes with the same ruthless precision he brought to a hostile takeover, and losing to the pan every single time. Tuesday evenings meant Sophia dropping by with paperwork and staying for wine, needling Damien about his big scary crime boss reputation in front of me until he threatened, without any real heat, to fire her. Thursdays meant Marco showing up uninvited to eat our leftovers and update us on Nero's ever-expanding list of forbidden furniture. "You're doing the thing," I said one night, catching him watching me instead of the television, that same soft, helpless expression from the airport tarmac. "What thing?" "The thing where you look at me like I'm about to vanish." "Old habit," he admitted, guiding my hand up to press against his chest, over the steady, unhurried rhythm of his heart. "I spent 34 years assuming anything good in my life came with a countdown. You didn't. I fell out of the sky onto your car during an assassination attempt," I said dryly. "I'm fairly sure that counts as a countdown of some kind. Best one I ever got." He kissed my knuckles, one by one, unbothered by how thoroughly Nero was currently drooling on both our feet at the end of the bed. "Best mistake, best coincidence, best everything. I'd survive 100 more ambushes if it meant landing here again. The following weekend, Sophia showed up unannounced with a stack of framed photographs she'd apparently been curating since the night of the shootout. The traffic cam still of me standing on the roof of Damien's car in a ruined wedding suit, blown up and printed in surprisingly high resolution, along with a candid shot from the wedding of Damien, kneeling with the family signet ring, held aloft like a man surrendering his entire kingdom, which, in a manner of speaking, he had. "I'm hanging these in the hallway," Sophia announced, already pulling a level and a hammer out of her bag, with the confidence of someone who had clearly done this before in other people's homes without asking. "Posterity demands it." "Absolutely not," Damien said, already losing the argument by the tone of his own voice. "They're staying," I said, taking the framed traffic cam photo from her hands and studying it properly for the first time. Myself mid-air, hair wild, dress shoes long since discarded, captured a half-second before the world tilted sideways into something better than either of my lives had ever promised me. I like this one. It's the exact moment everything changed. Damien came to stand behind me, chin resting against the top of my head, arms circling my waist, while we both looked at the photograph together. "For the record," he murmured, "I fell in love with you approximately 4 seconds after you landed on my car. I just didn't have the vocabulary for it yet." 4 seconds, I repeated, amused. "That's efficient, even for you." "I'm a decisive man," he said, unbothered, pressing a kiss behind my ear that made the whole argument about wall space entirely beside the point. I knew what I wanted. I just had to survive a gunfight, a gala, and an airport hostage situation to get it. Sophia hung the photographs anyway over Damien's continued token protests, and by the time she left, pausing only to steal a bottle of wine from the kitchen as payment for services rendered. The hallway leading to our bedroom told the whole story in pictures. Chaos, then courtship, then a wedding, then this. Whatever this was. Home, mostly. Home and Nero's increasingly ambitious collection of stolen socks, and Marco's standing Thursday invitation, and a man who still looked at me every night like the sky might open up again and take me back. It never did. And every night, without fail, meant Damien's hand finding mine under the covers before either of us fell asleep. Not out of habit, but out of a quiet, deliberate choice he made fresh every single time, like he still couldn't quite believe I'd stayed. "Say it again," I said, quiet, not for any strategic reason this time, just because I wanted to hear it. "I love you," Damien said, without a moment's hesitation, the words as steady and certain as they'd been at the altar. Little bride, terrifying husband, best decision I ever made at gunpoint. Nero chose that exact moment to let out a long, contented sigh from the foot of the bed, as if lending his own weighty approval to the proceedings, and Damien laughed, really laughed, the sound rolling warm through the dark room, before pulling me down against his chest, one hand splayed protectively over my back the same way it had been the very first night, in the back seat of a bulletproof car, with bullets cracking against the glass 6 inches from our heads. "You know," I said, listening to the steady drum of his heartbeat under my ear, "if you'd told me a year ago that I'd end up married to a mob boss, living in a penthouse with a dog the size of a small horse, arguing about pancakes on Sunday mornings, I'd have laughed you out of the room. And now? Now I can't imagine any version of either of my lives that doesn't end here." I tilted my head up to find him already watching me. That same soft, helpless expression settled permanently into the lines of his face these days. The coldest man in Manhattan, undone completely by nothing more dramatic than domestic quiet, and a dog who refused to sleep anywhere but the foot of our bed. Turns out the afterlife wasn't nearly as bad as advertised. I intend to keep it that way. Damien murmured against my hair, "For as long as you'll let me. Careful, Wolf." "That sounds dangerously close to a permanent commitment." "I already made one of those," he said, voice warm with amusement, fingers finding the ring on my hand in the dark and turning it slowly, thoughtfully, like he still couldn't quite believe it was real. "In a chapel, in front of 300 witnesses, after you tried to negotiate a real estate deal out of your own vows. I'm not going anywhere, little bride. Not this life, not the next one. If there's any justice left in whatever cosmic accounting system put you in my path to begin with." Outside, the city glittered on, indifferent to the two of us tangled together in the dark, one very large dog snoring at our feet, and for the first time in 2 lifetimes I let myself simply be happy. No schemes, no countdowns, no ghosts. Just this. Just him. Just home. If Ethan's story had you quietly cheering every time he refused to play the victim, tell us down in the comments. Would you have negotiated real estate before saying I do? Drop a like, hit subscribe, and stick around for the next story that turns heartbreak into something worth rooting for. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.